When it comes to the mafia underworld, the names you've heard are usually the biggest players, the dons, the capos, the underbosses. But for every headline-making mob boss, there's a handful of wild, unpredictable characters lurking in the shadows, too dangerous or too insane to ever get their proper due. Forget the Godfathers and Goodfellas. We're about to dive into the most insane mobsters you've never heard of. Men so ruthless and unhinged, even the mafia bosses knew to keep them at arm's length. Kicking off our list of insanity is Anthony Tony Shots Abbatemarco, a man who didn't just handle business, he dismantled it piece by bloody piece. And believe me, this list only plunges deeper into the madness from here. Anthony Tony Shots Abbatemarco's life began on April 6, 1922, with blood, betrayal and whispers in the shadows. Raised in Brooklyn's Park Slope, his early years at 702 President Street were steeped in the hushed secrets of family business that was anything but quiet. He was born into a legacy shaped by Prohibition-era criminals like his father, Frank Shots Abbatemarco, and his uncle, Mike Shots Abbatemarco. Anthony grew up with the echoes of their violent past, bootlegging, shootings and secret deals that always seemed to end in a closed casket. His uncle Michael's sudden wealth following Frankie Yale's assassination in 1928 became a death sentence. In the first wave of power shifts that would define Anthony's life, Mike Shots was murdered in the streets of Brooklyn that same year. But his father, Frank Shots, rose from the ashes, aligning himself with Giuseppe Profaci's growing empire, holding a vice grip on the numbers racket. It was a ruthless education, and Anthony learned early that loyalty was a commodity, traded as easily as bullets. By 1945, after a brief stint in the Marines and a quick medical discharge, Anthony returned to Brooklyn and took his place at his father's side, a loyal apprentice in the family's policy ring. By the 1950s, Tony Shots was born and began carving out his own reputation through his brutal methods. Arrests followed, inevitable in the life of a mobster's son, but they were badges of honor. When Tony and Frank were picked up for lottery conspiracy in 1952, it was more of a formal introduction to the justice system than a true fall. They served their time quietly, without any illusions of reform. The streets would still be waiting when they returned. Anthony stepped back into the world with sharpened instincts and a hardened heart. The real danger wasn't in the cops, it was in the people closest to you. By the late 1950s, Frank Shots had grown weary of paying tribute to Profaci. The boss's hand was too heavy, his greed insatiable. But in the mafia, dissent is treason, and treason is a death sentence. In November 1959, Profaci ordered Frank's murder, a decree carried out by none other than the Gallo brothers, trusted allies who had walked beside the Abbatemarcos for years. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than the bullets that felled his father. Then those sights were set on Anthony. But he was tipped off just in time to escape. As he slipped into hiding, the cold reality of the life he had been raised in began to take shape. He wasn't just playing a role in someone else's empire. He was now at the center of his own survival. The sting of betrayal was still fresh when Anthony emerged from hiding in 1961, this time on the wrong side of a murder attempt. He had agreed to set up Lawrence Gallo for assassination, aligning himself with Profaci's forces. But when a patrol officer interrupted the hit, chaos erupted. Gunfire lit up the night, and when the smoke cleared, the officer pointed a finger at Abbatemarco as the shooter. That night, the scales tipped further into darkness. Arrest warrants followed, but Anthony had already made his move. The fall was quick. He was no longer a trusted soldier in Profaci's army. He had been cast aside, his worth weighed against the demands of power. Yet, Tony Shots wasn't finished. He flipped the script, throwing his lot in with the Gallos, the same men who had put his father in the ground. It was a bold move, the kind that only someone who had tasted betrayal could make. The family business was war now, and alliances were as fluid as the blood running through Brooklyn's streets. When Profaci died in 1962, the chaos that had consumed the crime family paused. A new peace was brokered, and Tony Shots took his place in the reshuffled deck of the Colombo family. He stepped away from the gallows and found himself under the aging Salvatore Charlie Mineo. But peace in the mafia is like the eye of a storm, deceptive and temporary. Carmine Persico, once his subordinate, now stood in a position of power, and Tony Shots had to walk the tightrope of mafia politics with even more care. The Gallo rebellion flared up again in the early 1970s. led by the notorious Crazy Joey Gallo, whose recklessness brought him into direct conflict with the Colombos. As the war reignited, Tony stayed clear of the line of fire, watching as Gallo was gunned down in 1972. The war might have ended for Gallo, but the fractures within the Colombo family only deepened. By the mid-1970s, Carmine Persico had taken firm control of the family. Though Abbatemarco held a position of respect as underboss, the shadow of Persico loomed large. Anthony's movements were watched, recorded by FBI surveillance planted in his unremarkable 1971 Chevrolet. In the tapes, Tony boasted of his influence over gambling rings and scoffed at the weakening power of the Gambino family. But the real threat was from within. The Persico faction grew bolder and hungrier, and Anthony's allies began to vanish. Salvatore Albanese, a trusted figure in Tony's camp, attended a meeting to smooth things over with Persico's men. He was never seen again. Anthony knew the tide had turned against him. He went into hiding once more, handing control of his operations to subordinates while he watched from the sidelines as the Colombo family tore itself apart. By the early 1990s, the Mafia in New York was fracturing under its own weight. Persico, locked away in federal custody, couldn't hold the family together from behind bars. Old allegiances crumbled, and Anthony watched with wary eyes as the remnants of the once powerful Colombo family imploded in gangland civil wars. But even as the Persico faction faltered, Tony Shots knew he was running out of time. Abbatemarco had always been a survivor. He had outlived his father, his enemies, and his allies, but the walls were closing in. Persico's imprisonment did not offer the respite Anthony had hoped for. Instead, it birthed new enemies, ones younger and more ruthless, with no respect for the old rules. The life that had once promised power now demanded sacrifice, and Anthony was no longer the one holding the knife. The end came quietly for Tony Shots. He lived beyond his 83rd birthday, a rare feat for a man of his reputation, but the wars he had fought had long since claimed the best parts of him. He died as he had lived, in the shadow of violence, betrayal, and the bitter realization that in the Mafia, survival often feels like a curse. Tommy Ryan Eboli once ruled the streets like a king, his hands steeped in violence and blood, but even kings fall, and when they do, it's never pretty. On a sweltering summer night in 1972, Eboli's reign came to a brutal halt. This wasn't just a hit, it was a spectacle. A public execution ordered by the Mafia's upper echelons, a man who flew too close to the sun and paid the ultimate price. Let's delve into the savage power plays, the betrayals, and the lethal debt that marked the end of Tommy Eboli's bloody reign. Tommy Ryan Eboli, born in the scorching Italian summer of June 13, 1911, grew up as a man moulded by the fierce streets of Naples. But those streets were a far cry from where he would eventually meet his brutal final end, beneath the shadowy streets of Brooklyn in the dead of night. From Italy to New York, Eboli carved a bloody path through the criminal underworld, rising to helm one of the most powerful Mafia families, only to face a violent, inevitable descent into oblivion. The rise of Tommy Ryan Eboli was not an elegant one. It was a story of brute force and calculated ambition. A boxer who traded punches for bullets and climbed his way up from the dimly lit boxing rings to the throne of the Genovese family. His fingers stained with more than blood, his breath heavy with the smell of fear and power, Tommy had managed to survive in a world where most were swallowed whole. He became a confidant and enforcer to Vito Genovese, a man whose name was a whispered terror in New York's underworld. But like so many who rise too fast and fly too high, Eboli's reach soon outpaced his grasp. By the 1950s, Eboli had cemented his place among the Mafia elite. His name echoed in hushed conversations, in smoky back rooms, in boxing rings he controlled, and in gambling dens he ran with an iron fist. He managed fighters like Rocky Castellani, though his true fighter's spirit emerged when he clashed not with a boxer, but with the Madison Square Garden referee who dared rule against his man. The scene played out like a crescendo of chaos. Eboli storming the ring in a furious rage, his fists flying, shattering the thin veneer of respectability the Mafia tried to maintain. But that was Eboli. He was never one to play by the rules, and he didn't pretend to. His 60-day stint in jail after the assault was a mere slap on the wrist. But it was a sign perhaps of the storm to come. As the years rolled on, the weight of the Genovese crown grew heavier. After Genovese's incarceration in 1959, Eboli seized his opportunity, stepping in as a front boss. but he was not truly in control. Behind him loomed figures like Philip Lombardo and Michel Miranda, shadows in the darkness pulling strings, their unseen hands guiding the Genovese family as Eboli took the public fall for their decisions. It was a rise tainted by illusion, a man who wore the crown but never truly ruled. Still, Eboli was ambitious. The lure of power was intoxicating, and his desire to become the real boss, not just a puppet, gnawed at him like a festering wound, and with ambition came risk. It was in the early 1970s, amidst the crumbling empire he tried desperately to hold on to, that Eboli made the fatal miscalculation, a drug deal that was meant to solidify his position, but instead sealed his doom. Borrowing millions from Carlo Gambino, the rival mafia kingpin, who eyed Eboli's throne with envy, Eboli bet everything on the success of his drug operation. When the authorities cracked down, his empire crumbled, and so too did his chances of survival. Gambino, ever the vulture, circled closer, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came with the click of a phone call, a summons from Gambino disguised as a debt collector. There was no mercy in Gambino's eyes, only cold calculation. Eboli owed him millions, and in the mafia, debt isn't just settled with dollars, it's settled with blood. Gambino had always disliked Eboli, his brutish nature, his uncontrollable temper. Eboli had outlived his usefulness, and the Genovese family needed a new leader, one more aligned with Gambino's interests. And so the wheels of betrayal were set in motion, with Gambino pulling the strings behind the scenes. In the early hours of July 16th, 1972, Brooklyn was swathed in the kind of heavy darkness that clung to its streets like the sweat on a killer's brow. The quiet was deceptive, as the life of Tommy Eboli, leader of the Genovese crime family, was about to end in a brutal eruption of violence. He had parked his chauffeured Cadillac outside his girlfriend's modest apartment, unaware of the watching eyes and poised fingers. On that hot July night, Eboli walked to his car, the streetlights casting long, ominous shadows on the pavement. His mind, no doubt, was occupied with the weight of 1,000 problems, debts, enemies, betrayals. He likely didn't notice the truck that crawled down the street, its headlights flickering as if they too were in on the plot. He was barely seated before a crack split the night. The shots came fast, tearing through the summer air like a blade through flesh. 5 bullets pierced Eboli's skull and neck. The man who had once stood at the peak of New York's crime syndicates slumped forward, lifeless in an instant. When the shots rang out, they didn't just mark the end of a man, they marked the end of an era. Eboli, the boxer-turned-boss, lay dead in the street, his blood mixing with the city's grime. He had risen through violence, and in violence he fell. Eboli's death was a gruesome exclamation point on a life lived in shadows and soaked in blood. The power he had craved was now beyond his reach, handed to others who would continue the cycle of crime and betrayal. His funeral, attended only by a handful of family and law enforcement, was a cold, lonely affair, a stark contrast to the once vibrant and dangerous life he had led. As the earth swallowed him whole, it seemed to take with it the last vestiges of the brutal force that had once made Tommy Ryan Eboli a name to be feared. In the unforgiving hierarchy of the mafia, death is always just one misstep away. John Camilleri, once an indomitable force within Buffalo's criminal underworld, discovered on his 63rd birthday that loyalty is as fragile as the candle flame on a cake. Today, we delve into the deadly web of mob politics, ambition, and the ultimate betrayal that left one of Buffalo's most notorious mobsters dead in the gutter. John Camilleri had spent his life dancing with death, but on the night of his 63rd birthday, death was about to lead him to his final dance. It was May 8th, 1974. Camilleri had celebrated with friends at Roseland Restaurant, the ambiance thick with smoke and laughter, the kind that drifted lazily above cheap whiskey and black coffee. His face, marked by years of stress and deception, carried a hard-earned smile. There was a brief reprieve from the tension that had wound through the corridors of Buffalo's underworld. But as the night wore on, the shadow of fate stretched long across the worn leather booths. When he stepped out of the restaurant to attend a wake, the air outside was thick and damp. The streets whispered, damp with the residue of a light rain, but Camilleri barely noticed. He walked with the ease of a man who had survived too many close calls to be rattled by one more. His body moved like a machine, habitual, automatic. His hand rested loosely on the door handle of his Cadillac, a final pause before returning to the comfort of his birthday dinner. But in the dark, a figure waited. Across the street, a sedan lurked, almost invisible beneath the dim glow of a dying streetlight. Its engine idled softly, the steady hum blending with the patter of rain dripping from the lampposts. Inside, a man sat still, cold eyes fixed on Camilleri's back as he moved, oblivious to the predator. The gunman waited, pulse steady, the weight of the revolver a familiar comfort in his lap. The moment had been planned carefully, each detail like a stitch in the dark tapestry of betrayal that had begun to suffocate Camilleri. The tension had been simmering for months, a slow burn beneath the surface of Buffalo's crime families. Discontent was no longer whispered in back rooms, but growled openly in cigar-laced meetings. The fracture between the rebel underworld faction and the old guard had become irreparable. Camilleri, once a powerful lieutenant in the Magaddino crime family, had staked his loyalty with Josefino and Sampieri, pushing for new blood to seize control of Labourers Local 210. It was a bold, dangerous move, one that had earned him as many enemies as allies. Earlier that spring, he had stood on the cusp of triumph. The air was charged with anticipation as Fino's son, Ronald, a charismatic force of nature, ran for business manager of Local 210. Camilleri had thrown his weight behind the campaign, his presence at every meeting a reminder of the old family's might. When Ronald won, Camilleri's smirk was wide enough to split his face. But power shifts in the Mafia are as fleeting as smoke rings, and soon the sweet victory turned into a bitter betrayal. When Ronald refused to grant Camilleri the coveted position of personnel director, the insult was profound, cutting deeper than any gunshot. Enraged, Camilleri's temper flared and the cool demeanor that had served him for decades cracked. He ranted, fuming about Fino's lack of gratitude, and in his anger made a fatal mistake. He publicly threatened to withdraw his crew from the Buffalo crime family, a declaration that sent ripples through the underworld like the first tremors before an earthquake. His fall came swiftly. What Camilleri didn't realize was that his threats had sealed his fate. The family couldn't afford disloyalty, not with cracks already forming in its foundation. Those above him, those who had once respected him, now saw him as a liability, a loose end that needed tying up. And so, on the night of his birthday, the gunman waited. The hit had been sanctioned with cold precision, the threads of the conspiracy stretching across Buffalo's crime world. Every detail had been orchestrated down to the very last second. The light-colored sedan slid quietly into place behind Camilleri's Cadillac, its tires barely making a sound on the slick pavement. As Camilleri turned the key in his car door, the first shot echoed through the night. A .38 caliber slug ripped through the humid air, tearing into Camilleri's chest. His body jerked violently, the pain immediate, electrifying. His legs buckled beneath him as he staggered, gasping, his hand grasping at the slick metal of his car. Blood spread across his shirt, dark and warm as he tried to breathe, but the air refused to enter his lungs. Another shot rang out, then a third, each one a punctuation mark to a life lived in shadows. Camilleri crumpled onto the wet sidewalk, his eyes wide with shock. The reality of betrayal hitting him harder than the bullets. The sedan screeched away, tires skidding against the wet pavement, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had come. The world around him grew darker as the blood pooled beneath his broken body, soaking into the cracks in the sidewalk. The restaurant door opened behind him, and a couple stumbled out, laughter dying on their lips as they saw the body, their faces pale beneath the neon sign. But by then, John Camilleri was already gone. The police would come, flashing lights and yellow tape would turn the street into a crime scene, a spectacle for the onlookers who whispered about mafia vendettas and underworld wars. They would file their reports, take photographs and scribble down notes about Buffalo's public enemy number 14. But the hit was clean. There would be no witnesses brave enough to name the gunman. No one who had seen anything would be foolish enough to speak. As the night stretched on, Camilleri's empire crumbled. The man who had once wielded power over Buffalo's labor unions, the man who had brokered deals and commanded fear, was now just another body on the streets, a victim of the very world he had helped create. The rise, the fall, the final descent, it had all been inevitable. And in the cold streets of Buffalo, the underworld moved on, as it always did, without a second thought. When it comes to the dark underbelly of organized crime, names like Capone and Gotti tend to steal the spotlight. But beneath the surface of the Mafia's bloody history lurk shadowy figures whose rise to power was just as ruthless, just as chilling. Enter James Balestrere, stonemason by trade, mob boss by fate. Born in Sicily and raised on the unforgiving streets of Kansas City, Balestrere carved out his empire during the lawless days of Prohibition, using bricks, bullets and backroom deals to build a criminal dynasty. Today, we dive into the forgotten legend of Kansas City's quiet kingpin, a man whose control reached far beyond the city limits and whose demise still raises questions. James Balestrere was no ordinary man, not in the ways that mattered most to those who brushed shoulders with him, nor to those who whispered his name in the dark recesses of Kansas City's underworld. Born into the sweltering sun and dust of Bagheria, Sicily, on June 24, 1891, he carried with him more than just a stonemason's trade when his family set foot on American soil in 1903. As they docked in Milwaukee, the scent of promise and decay clung to the air, a potent mix that would follow him through his early years, setting him on a path where labor, blood and power blended into one intoxicating pursuit. What began as sweat on bricks would in time evolve into something far more dangerous, a rise to prominence in Kansas City's mob scene during the bruising years of Prohibition. The streets were alive with a different sort of energy by the time Balestrere's family moved to Kansas City in 1908. The city thrummed with the unmistakable hum of opportunity laced with vice. From the bricklayer's hands, he transitioned to the hands that shook deals behind closed doors: bootlegging, gambling, narcotics. The ingredients for an empire were simple: blood, fear, and sugar. By the time Prohibition strangled the nation in 1920, the DiGiovanni brothers, Joseph and Pietro, were already entrenched in the bootlegging world, and Balestrere slid seamlessly into their operations, providing the lifeblood of moonshine with endless supplies of sugar. His was the work of a silent architect, brick by brick, stacking fortunes that others spilled blood to protect. The first rise came slowly yet inexorably. It was during this time, in the dim-lit corners of speakeasies and backroom dealings, that Balestrere constructed his greatest feat, the White House. It wasn't the sort of place adorned with patriotic fervour, but rather a den of iniquity dressed up as a restaurant and casino, with fortunes lost as quickly as the drinks were poured. The gamblers had little idea that behind the walls, Balestrere and the DiGiovannis played a different game. Politics and crime intertwined like the twisting vines of a Sicilian vineyard, as men like Balestrere leveraged power within the North Side Democratic Club and Tammany-esque machines of Kansas City's political landscape. But with each rise comes the inevitable shadow of a fall. The first sign of trouble came in 1950 when Charles Binaggio, the mob boss tied deeply to the Pendergast political machine, was found with his chief lieutenant, Charles Mad Dog Gargotta, sprawled in pools of their own blood at a political headquarters. The air was thick with fear, the smell of betrayal clinging to every breath. Balestrere stood as a silent witness to the aftermath, his gaze hardened. He had not pulled the trigger, no, others would take that credit, but the cold logic of the crime reverberated. Senator James P. Kem decried the killings as an unholy union of politics and the underworld, but for Balestrere it was simply the cost of doing business. Binaggio was a figurehead, a puppet whose strings had been tangled. The old power structures were crumbling, and with the blood drying on the marble floor, Balestrere knew he would have to pivot. And pivot he did with a steely resolve. Balestrere, no longer merely an underling or lieutenant, emerged as a senior partner in the mob's leadership. A calculated move that put him at the table where decisions were made with precision and force. Alongside names like Tomastano Lococo, Charles Carollo and Anthony Gizzo, he shared the spoils of power, shrouding their operations in political smokescreens. Together, they rebuilt the broken empire, their control spanning not just Kansas City, but stretching tendrils as far as St. Louis, Chicago and beyond. Balestrere had risen once more, seemingly untouchable. But the underworld is an ever-shifting landscape of loyalties and grudges, and no empire is immune to its tides. In 1959, Balestrere, now nearly 70, felt the weight of his years pressing against his chest. The grind of politics, of bootlegging, of narcotics, all had left their scars. He was a relic, a monument to a time of ruthless ambition and quiet savagery. But time has no mercy, not even for the kingpins of crime. His final fall was as inevitable as it was quiet. October 19th, 1959. The newspapers would announce it as a death from natural causes, a man succumbing to the years and the strains of a life lived dangerously. But there were whispers. There always were. Some murmured that it wasn't his heart that failed him, but rather the invisible hand of vengeance that reached out from the shadows of old grudges. Had his enemies been watching too closely, waiting for his final moments of weakness? Or was it simply the culmination of a life spent constructing an empire where every brick was laid atop a foundation of bodies? The truth would die with him, buried beneath the Kansas City skyline, where his name would linger like the fading notes of a forgotten tune. The crime continued, the deals were struck, and James Balistrera, the mason turned mobster, was lowered into the ground, his legacy built from the ashes of his enemies and the blood of those who had dared to stand in his way. When you're a trusted right-hand man to the most notorious mob boss in America, the line between life and death is razor thin. Phil D'Andrea knew this better than anyone. A shadow in Al Capone's empire, D'Andrea was more than just muscle. He was the silent force in the outfit's inner circle, always armed, always watching. From sitting armed behind Capone during his infamous trial to orchestrating extortion schemes in the glitz of Hollywood, D'Andrea's journey was littered with betrayal, bullets and bodies. But even a man of such darkness couldn't escape the fate he dealt to so many. Join us as we dive deep into the terrifying endeavors of Phil D'Andrea, a man who stood behind Capone until the day his own past reached out with bloody hands to drag him down to hell. Phil D'Andrea was born on September 7, 1889, in the shadowed alleys of New York, where bloodlines ran deep and crime ran deeper. His life, from a young age, was intertwined with the underworld. By the time he entered his 20s, he found himself entangled in the Chicago outfit, a cog in the grand machine run by the notorious Al Capone. His beginnings were quiet, a mere enforcer, a shadow trailing Capone's towering figure. But his rise in the ranks of the outfit was anything but silent. It was the summer of 1931, and the air in Chicago buzzed with tension. Capone, untouchable for so long, was finally on trial for tax evasion of all things. As the courtroom filled, Capone's bulging frame occupied the defendant's chair. And there, in the shadows just behind him, sat D'Andrea, unwavering. Capone trusted few, and D'Andrea, with his stone-set jaw and eyes that never strayed from their target, was one of them. They called him Capone's constant companion in the papers. But in the darker corners of the city, he was something else. Capone's silent shield, ready to strike. The courtroom was a theatre of power. The prosecution circled like vultures, but D'Andrea's presence was the steady thrum beneath the noise. He blended into the background, or so it seemed. In truth, he was a coiled snake, a piece on the chessboard that could shift at any moment. And shift it did, when the bailiff spotted the glint of steel beneath D'Andrea's coat. As the trial adjourned that October afternoon, the Chicago police pounced, arresting D'Andrea at the courthouse steps. They pried the gun from his hands, but not before he sent a cold, knowing smile to Capone. The message was clear. In this game, he was more than muscle. D'Andrea's loyalty to Capone never wavered, but after Capone's fall from power, Phil's world shifted dramatically. Power vacuums in the underworld were dangerous, and Chicago became a powder keg, the fuse burning ever closer. D'Andrea moved swiftly, securing himself as president of the Italo-American National Union, a front for the ever-evolving syndicate that kept the outfit alive. He was a man of the old guard, but his ambitions were far from outdated. It was no longer just about brute force. D'Andrea had seen the future in Capone's courtrooms and tax ledgers. It was about money, influence, and the subtle violence of control. By the early 1940s, D'Andrea was knee-deep in the Hollywood entertainment industry, an industry ripe for extortion. Alongside fellow outfit heavies like Paul Ricca and Louis Campagna, he built an empire out west. Stars, producers and studio heads all found themselves at the mercy of the outfit's demands. The glittering lights of Hollywood were dimmed by shadows of mob intimidation. But that empire wasn't built on handshakes. It was built on fear, threats and bodies. The fall came swiftly. In 1943, federal authorities closed in on the Hollywood rackets. The trials were vicious, the evidence mounting. D'Andrea and his crew faced 10 years, a sentence that felt like an eternity. For D'Andrea, prison wasn't just a cage, it was the embodiment of the fall. 3 years behind bars stripped him of his empire and his grip on Chicago's underworld. Yet when he walked free in 1947, a ghost of his former self, there was still a faint flicker of power in his eyes. It was during the trials of his later years, in front of the Kefauver Committee in 1950, that D'Andrea faced his reckoning. He stood before the US government, eyes sharp, but hands weathered by the years and the blood they had helped spill. He was grilled for hours, the truth a knife's edge he carefully danced along. He survived, but not unscathed. His presence at the committee hearings only confirmed what the world already knew. Phil D'Andrea was a relic of a time when bullets spoke louder than words. By 1952, D'Andrea had retreated to California, the sunlit escape far from the blood-stained streets of Chicago. But the shadows followed. John F. Arena, an Italian-language newspaper editor and rival, was gunned down in broad daylight. D'Andrea's name was whispered behind closed doors, a man once again tied to murder, even in his twilight years. He was sought for questioning, but the law never caught up with him. The underworld rarely lets go of its ghosts. On September 18, 1952, Phil D'Andrea died in California, far from the cold winds of Chicago and the thunderous roar of Capone's reign. But his story didn't end with his death. Federal legislators reopened investigations into his parole and his role in the outfit's empire. His death was a fall, but the rise of suspicion and inquiry into his life was the final curtain on his stage of crime. The man who once sat silently behind Capone, gun in hand, had become a shadow etched into history, a reminder that the darkest parts of the underworld never truly die.